Hey everyone, my name's Kaif, and with me I have my very good friend Surya.
Hey guys, we are starting a brand new YouTube channel, Everything Cyber, where we are excited on going about different topics, whether be it cybersecurity or some technical topics.
And on top of that, we will have tons of hands-on technical sessions where we explore new technologies, review the latest and greatest tools, and much, much more. The goal of this channel is to grow the thinking muscles and hands-on knowledge of both our listeners and ourselves.
Yeah, we're excited to have you on this journey, and let's jump on to this episode. We are recording now.
Recording. Awesome. Hello, everybody. My name's Kaif, and with me I have Surya.
Hey guys.
And welcome to another episode of Everything Cyber. Today's episode is episode number
4.
Cool. And in today's episode, we are talking about a practical approach to zero trust. So when it comes to zero trust, people tend to get very vague and very high level. And understandably so, because it is such a broad topic.
Yep.
On the other hand, we have all these vendors telling us do this, do that, use our product, and achieve zero trust. So today, we are going to approach zero trust on a bit more pragmatic manner and talk specifics. That's something no one seems to do about zero trust. The way, not no one, very few people seem to do about zero trust.
Yeah.
The way we will do today is look at the different layers and principles of zero trust and give concrete examples on how to achieve those.
Okay.
These will help people understand zero trust and the different aspects of it a bit better when we talk specifics. Now, a couple of heads up, right? The first one is because we are being so deliberately specific today, it won't necessarily be comprehensive and all-encompassing because there will be so many other ways to achieve the same things. And they vary from company to company and people's preferences, right? Everything has pros and cons. But what we are giving today is concrete examples so people understand better. So in short, if you are someone working in an organization who wants to implement zero trust, we will actually lay out some actual steps that you would be having to go through or implement to achieve zero trust architecture.
Yep.
So without further ado, Surya, I pass it to you to set up the scene and tell us how are we gonna do it.
Yeah, I think before we go further down, I think the first thing to do for sure is to set up a structured way in which we look zero trust. So we'll try to look at it from a bottom-up view. At the core or at the center, we have like our data, like the whole goal of any systems we have is to protect our data, right? In the end of the day. So we have our data, which sits in some form of infrastructure that holds the data. And then that infrastructure is on some network. So this network is used to like access this data or this infrastructure, and then communicate and perform certain actions on it. So how do you get to perform actions on this? So you use like some sort of application, right? So you have like an application that you can then view the data, read the data, create, update, delete, and the CRUD functions. And then if you go a step further, where does this application sit? This application usually sits in some form of endpoint, right? It's like an endpoint where you can open the application, view it, and then perform certain actions. And then how do you get into this endpoint, right? In the end, how does this all get tied together? It's like by identity you could think of, right? The last step. You need some form of identity to get into the device and then, continue the flow, right? And this whole set of layers, if you think about it, encompass the different parts of zero trust, right? And each segment, we'll have a look on like how we can go about that.
Nice. So these bottom-up approach from data to all the way identity, if you think about it, is how we do security, right? So security is basically when we say we are doing cybersecurity in different shapes or sizes, we are protecting some form of data. And I like how you structured it in a very nice way, from all the way data to different layers of it, all the way to how we access it and who accesses it and
Yeah.
how. And this brings us to the next point, which is the principles of zero trust, right? Zero trust is, for the audience, built on three main principles, which is verify explicitly, apply least privileged access, and assume breach. So let's look at the principles of zero trust, and I'll touch on them a little bit to explain what they are. The first, we have verify explicitly, which means that even though a user has been verified before, don't just assume that they are who they used to be throughout the entire system.
Yeah.
So throughout the system, in various data points, verify them again whenever they are accessing, especially a more sensitive data. Um, that restricts people from moving laterally and attacker gaining access to multiple systems. The next one is applying least privilege. So give people uh, only as much as access as they need. And no point giving everyone admin privileges, right? That can only cause havoc. And lastly, assume breach. Don't think that your system is impenetrable, and always assume that the attacker is inside and can get inside, and basically define the practices accordingly.
Yeah.
What we will do now is each of the layers Surya defined. We have our data, infrastructure, network, applications, endpoints, and identity.
Yeah.
We will see that how each of the zero trust principles on one hand and each of our modern application layers on other hand, they come in together and they make the entire architecture a more secure one. So basically what I'm trying to say, that for each layer, we will see how the three zero trust principles harden that layer, right?
Yeah.
That brings me to the second heads up, for our audience, that today's episode, it's gonna be a bit more content heavy, in the sense that if you don't necessarily come from a very technical background, it can feel like a lot, which is completely fine. Feel free to pause the video at any second, look things up, rewatch certain parts as many times as you need to. So this is not necessarily going to be an episode that you power run through it, but something you consult again from time to time when your organization or is going through that zero trust journey, or when you just need comprehensive knowledge of zero trust in a practical way. So, Surya, let's dive straight into it. The first layer we have is our identity layer.
Yep.
So for identity, one way I think the first principle, verify explicitly, comes into play is having one single federated sign-on, which we call single sign-on.
Yeah.
And what I mean by that is, we want to verify users again and again at different points. And if users had to use 20 different passwords for 20 different things, it's going to be very, very sucky from a user experience perspective. And from the defender's point of view, it's going to be hard to maintain all that. So instead, we put all of our resources or focus into one single identity and use that to access everything.
Yeah.
One single point of hardening, right?
Yeah.
So that's something what I had.
Yeah.
What do you have?
Yeah, I agree with that. The other one I had is like MFA. So how can we reinforce this identity itself, right? So just because you know the username and password doesn't mean that we can trust you, right? So we can use other forms of authentication via SMS, a phone call, or even like an app like Authenticator, where you get a one-time passcode to verify like, hey, this is me, as the first confirmation via username and password, and then a second factor you can have via that. Some other ways you can also do is like via hardware key, using FIDO keys and so on. Yeah.
Okay, so while we are on the identity layer, let's look at the second principle, least privilege, and come up with some practical ways we implement least privilege. The first one is role-based access control. to put it in a bit more layman's terms, let's say I am from the finance department and that's my role, right? So as a member of the finance department, I only need access to certain data, certain things, certain data, certain
Applications,
resources,
yeah.
applications. I don't need access to maybe our dev and production environment, but I need access to our analytics data, transaction and customer purchase data. So things like that. So restricting people's activity and usage based on their roles.
Yeah, absolutely agree with that. Something that kind of ties into that is just-in-time access. So basically, the goal of this is that, hey, so you have access to this particular resource, for example, in case you already have it,
Mhm.
you're like a non-admin user, and you're like, hey, I need to elevate myself to an admin user to perform some actions. So the best
Mhm.
way to do that is not just to provide them the complete role, like, hey, just take admin, but give them the admin
Mhm.
role for some duration, right? So you only
Yeah.
are given access and roles based on when you need it. So it doesn't. So this is kind of ties into the least privilege. Hey, you only provide them access when they need it, not when, like, not always, right?
Not
Yeah.
always. That's right. That's right. Next principle we have is assume breach. So let's see what some of the assume breach related controls we can implement. The first one I have is risk-based authentication and access control. And what do I mean by that is whenever a user, or whether that's a human user or non-human user, is trying to access something,
Mm-hmm.
we can calculate their risk rating. This can be done in various ways based on what data the user is trying to access, when they last got authenticated, their location, whether they're inside the office, outside the office, their access time, etc., right?
Yeah.
Based on all of these things, we can generate an risk rating.
Mm-hmm.
And based on that risk rating, we can do access control.
Yeah.
So things like if our risk rating is high, by default, change what data I can access to.
Yeah.
Similarly, by default, change what authentication methods I need. So
Mm-hmm.
if I'm a high risk user, I need to mandatory have multi-factor authentication. Whereas if I'm a low risk user, just a visitor of our company, I don't need multi-factor authentication or anything. So that's one example of always assume breach. And okay, how does this risk-based approach fit into our assume breach, right?
Mm-hmm.
So by doing these things, we are sort of assuming that all the users we are gonna get has some risk associated with it, that at any time an attacker might be trying to access our system.
Yeah.
So based on that fact, we always try to calculate the risk and act accordingly, and that's how it fits into that assume breach.
Yeah.
Um,
I think another one that kind of again ties into what you said is access reviews, right? So the whole point of us,
mhm,
like, we give a certain level of access to users and we need to monitor these, right? A good way to, like, so you can assume breach in the sense that, hey, someone has access, this user is no longer in the organization and this access is still there. So that's kind of a breach vector or an attack vector you have, right? So
mhm.
having like a continuous automated access review allows you to like close these loopholes and ensure that you're always secure and always you're allowing to implement the concept of assume breach.
I think that is a holistic cover of the identity layer. Next up, I have the endpoint layer. And for this endpoint layer, we're again going to talk about the different um, principles of zero trust.
Yep.
Do you want to start, Surya?
Yeah, I think the most common one I can think of is group policy enforcement. So, for
Mhm.
example, if an endpoint is tied to an organization, right? An organization wants to enforce its policies and certain set of rules on the device to ensure that it's compliant. And to do that, they send it a set of group policies. You know, you have to implement it, and then you're like, hey, I enforce this. So every time you try to authenticate this device, like, hey, this is me, I'd like to come and connect with the organization services, you can allow that to happen only if it meets your group policy criteria. And that allows you to verify explicitly each time, like, hey,
Mm,
is my device meeting the organization's requirements? Kind of.
nice, nice. Cool. One other way of achieving verify explicitly principle for endpoints is not only verifying the endpoints, but also the apps installed by users, especially the ones installed manually by users explicitly.
Hmm.
Because endpoints are not just the device itself, but also the applications that reside within that endpoint. So even though you have verified the endpoint explicitly at a given point of time, there can be a situation where a new malicious application is being installed in that endpoint, and you by leveraging that trusted status of that endpoint or that device, that application can do some kind of damage.
Yep.
So we will very explicitly verify not just the endpoint, but also we will have specific policies to regulate the applications inside it. That takes care of the verify explicitly. The next is let's talk about least privilege.
Yeah.
Okay, how does least privilege tie into endpoint, Surya?
It's kind of similar, I would say, in terms
Mhm.
of what steps or what paths would you enforce. So here again, it ties into the concept of like just-in-time access. So if you want to access a particular resource, right, or the endpoint itself, you ensure that you're only allowed to access that for that particular duration.
Mhm.
So it's
Mm.
similar to identity, but again, here in this case, it's particularly for endpoints itself.
Yeah, same. Similar to the previous one, I would say role-based access control is certainly quite important, not just for human identities, but also for machines and the machines that the humans are using. I'll use a concrete example we have at Atlassian, right? So we have our customer data safe and locked, a very protected data pool. And not all systems can access that data pool to whether you're from the security team, whether you're from the data engineering team, to access that data pool, your device needs to be explicitly registered on a system ledger
Yeah.
that, hey, this device is going to be granted access to our customer data for X amount of time, and only then and you can access raw customer data. That's another example of role-based access for endpoints,
Yeah.
um, which satisfy the least privilege concept we have. For endpoints, let's now talk about assume breach a
Yeah.
little bit.
Yeah, I have a very straightforward one, but one of the most
Mhm.
important ones, which is some form of endpoint detection and response that you have. So like an EDR tools. So the goal of this is that you're getting all these data sources coming from this device, and it allows you to notify, like in case there's any abnormal activity happening in the device, like any behaviors that you do not expect from the device, right? So this allows
Mhm.
you to assume breach, like, hey, this device could possibly be breached. Now what are the next steps do I take, right? So then you can prevent the attack or prevent whatever you have detected in case it's malicious. And in case you need to do not just prevent, but you can also give certain responses, like, hey, like isolate this device, or like try to terminate and contain this
Mm.
application, right? Some kind of instant response. The other one I would say that ties into it is also like data loss. So you can have like a DLP solution, and that allows you to
Mhm.
give some sort of data loss prevention from both your device and maybe even like you accessing your emails and so on.
Similarly, in terms of assume breach, I can also say for devices, we can have automated device health management. So instead of waiting for an incident to happen, we can have like building on top of your monitoring service, we can have device sanctions and quarantine. Assuming that a breach happens and a device health for cert. So by what I mean by device health is, let's say, it can be a series of different things, whether starting from its configuration and software to all the way whether a known potential, let's say, malicious software, virus, or even a threat actor has been in that device or not. We can automatically quarantine or sanction it
Yeah.
and wait until the health of that device is still restored and then automatically put it back into our system again. So that's one thing that if we assume that breaches can happen anytime, can help us harden our security posture more.
Yes.
So
Absolutely.
that takes care of Surya of identity and the devices that bear that identity. Now we're going to look into the next layer, which we use our devices to access some application, right?
Yeah.
And that's how we interact. That like at least mostly humans as well as non-humans, we application with our underlying infrastructure or a network via some application.
Yeah.
So let's look at that application layer. First up, we will have the verify explicitly. Do you want to talk about that first?
Yeah, sure. I think an important point for this is again a single sign-on base. So
For the applications.
for the applications, yes, for the applications. So you have like 10 applications. You're logging into your Salesforce, your MailChimp, your Azure environment or AWS environment. So there's so many different applications that you need to access to. So if you're using a single sign-on, again, it allows you to have a centralized place where you can enforce more policies, make it more secure, and also provide the user with a seamless experience. So he or she just needs to remember like a single password with like a multi-factor authentication that allows them to gain access, right? So I think single sign-on is for sure a core principle for verify explicitly within an application.
Awesome. To verify explicitly as well, I feel one crucial practical thing people can do is have a catalog of all the apps, or have a centralized place where we can see all the apps our users can access, or all the apps that interact with our infrastructure, right? This can be our third-party apps as well as our built-in apps. And a lot of the existing cloud providers, they have built-in services that can do that. So without being very vendor specific, I think almost all the major cloud providers have that. And that can definitely help us a lot in that verify explicitly sort of approach.
Yeah, just to
the next
add,
step for application. Yeah,
just to add another part, also that also helps you prevent against like rogue apps, right? Some malicious application coming into your system, that also helps you do that.
Building on what we have been discussing, now we're gonna focus on this privilege for applications. And for that, we can have is review the data that are being accessed by these apps, right? Don't have pretty much similar to humans, how we review what data the humans can access. We also should do it for the applications. Have very strict limits on what data can be accessed by what app, and also have visibility over.
Again, similar to the past, having some sort of just-in-time access to your applications. So this can be users trying to access these applications, so they only need particular roles, or it can go into the application itself. So the application can only access particular resources for some period of time before it moves to the next service, for example. So again, just-in-time access comes again to play. So you provide a least privileged access to your application itself.
Awesome. Cool. So let's have a look at the assume breach principle in terms of the application layer. And I know one we talked about a lot is session monitoring and response based on that. So yeah, I know you wanted to talk about that.
Yeah, it's for sure a very interesting one because you can monitor sessions within an application, and you can also monitor for any abnormal activity. Again, we are looking at behaviors here or alerts that we can have. And once you notify of an abnormal activity, you can then perform actions. You can respond to it. And this is like you trying to assume breach. So like you're assuming some certain breaches happen within the application, and you want to do some sort of prevention and response for it. Again, hardening your security posture. So a response could be like terminating the session itself, or like ending the session, resetting all of the applications, or like just isolating the application itself in case it's very severe.
Yeah, cool. In consideration of time, I'm actually going to move into the next layer because I feel we have quite a few practical examples of achieving zero trust. The next layer we have is the network layer. For verifying explicitly, I know we can do a lot with the network layer, right, Surya?
Yeah, this is a ton. It's probably one of the most diverse ones. So in this, the main point that we have for sure is like verifying all types of traffic that are coming into a network, right? And this is basically controlled by the policies that you set at your subnet level, or at your VPC and so on. So you verify what traffic is coming internally from within your internal network itself. Like you can have segmentation between them. Then you can also have from your public to your internal network, and then also from your internal network to public. So you can monitor all these sorts of traffics that are going through and then restrict them as needed.
So similar to monitoring and having explicitly defined authentication for all kinds of traffic, I feel like the network themselves also need to be segmented. This falls more into the least privileged side of things, where um, we don't want one big network. Instead, we want a network broken into specific parts based on their functionality or region or whatever it can be.
Yeah.
That way, even though the attacker gets access to one single part of the network, they can't freely move around in the network. And that small part of the network can have micro segmentations within themselves.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely agree with that. And similar to tie into that point is to limit access to critical data and applications by policy. So hey, so I'm moving like using this network and I'm in a particular subnet. So from that, I can only view like read only data to these applications and resources. So if I need to go to view sensitive information, then I need to go to a more secure environment or subnet, right? So that all ties into place of like least privilege. So like, hey, only like certain subnets or certain micro-segmented networks are allowed to access these sensitive informations and applications.
Interesting. On the other hand, for the assume breach part of the principle, we can have similar to how you want to verify all traffic, we also want to encrypt. So
Yeah.
what common mistake I see is people encrypt the inbounds and outbounds, but often they don't have the necessarily the same amount of encryption in the internal. So within the network, when the data is flowing, it's not necessarily have the same standards of encryption. What we can do is have the same layer of encryption for all three aspects of data flow, internal, inbounds, and outbounds within the network. And I
Yeah.
think that can be that really embodies that assume breach mentality that we will just we are working under the assumption that the attacker is within our network and we want to restrict the damage that are being done.
Yeah. Yeah. Another one I can think of for sure is like threat protection. So you want to protect against threats. A common tool that's implemented in these networks is usually like a WAF, like or a proxy. So you want to limit traffic sources, right? So you don't want like users to be accessing malicious websites, known malicious websites and signatures. So you can limit those traffics via using a proxy in such cases, right? Again, this is like for you thinking that, hey, your users can be accessing malicious resources, and let's prevent that. Another really futuristic way you could think about is like using machine learning filterings. So machine learning, as it detects like this kind of malicious traffic happening from a particular resource or infrastructure itself, it can start blocking it, and further monitoring can be put in place to alert us investigators like, hey, there's something suspicious happening here, so go and like research more on that. Yeah.
Nice. Cool. So we covered the network layer and how different principles of zero trust can harden our network side of things and some practical examples. We're now going to do the same, but for the infrastructure layer, right? Which is the second last layer and the closest to our data. So for that, the first principle of zero trust, verify explicitly. I have a very interesting one related to this, and this again comes from my work, that is the infrastructure as a code. So that helps us define secure building blocks. So we want to be verifying explicitly all layers of information and data flowing through, right?
Yeah.
And imagine having to implement all those verification checks in all of your infrastructures manually. Wouldn't there be a very easy way to have all of those checks built right from the start. And that's where infrastructure as a code really helps us. Because if you can deploy new infrastructure by default in a secure way, then that goes a huge way in terms of securing and achieving that verify explicitly motto. So that's something I see a lot of organizations do, and there's a big push in the industry for as well.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, coming to like the least privileged side of things, right? If you have to
Mhm.
look at infrastructure from least privileged sides, again we'll get into just-in-time access, in the sense that so if
It's
yeah,
all
it's
everywhere.
everywhere. It is the most basic concept that is utilized across least
Hmm.
privilege, across all the layers, right?
Hmm.
And the goal here is that, hey, so again, as mentioned before, particular users are coming into my infrastructure and trying to get access, and I can then limit this access to my infrastructure, like, hey, only these users can access or these cannot, and this allows you to also monitor that in particular cases, and you can also like help you in like segmenting your infrastructure further and then providing access to that.
Hmm. Yeah. Cool. So moving on to the last pillar for infrastructure, which is assume breach. So for assume breach, the first thing I want to say is it is very important to continuously monitor our infrastructure because in case of a breach, the quicker we know that what parts of our infrastructure has been affected and how much is the blast radius, the better we can respond to it, right?
Yep.
And this continuous monitoring, especially relates to the configuration and the software side of the infrastructure.
Mm-hmm.
So we always want to be ensuring that the infrastructure is properly configured according to the policies, as well as they're running on the latest software, or at least a bill, what we call a bill of software, that what versions of software is running on each of the
Mm-hmm.
different infrastructure, right? So that's certainly one thing we can do. What's the other thing, Surya?
Yeah, the other thing for sure is like some sort of disaster recovery. So, in case someone breaches and this infrastructure, like for example, in case a server is like completely corrupted or it's ransomware, so in some way of shape or
Mhm.
form that we must be able to recover from that. So you have like backups of some sorts, or like being able to like completely isolate this infrastructure and then deploy a new one in its place with the backup data. So that would be
Mhm.
really helpful and allows us to have some prevention mechanisms against breaches.
Nice. So we had a quick look at the infrastructure layer and the three principles of zero trust affecting positive change in each in various different ways. So now we're gonna finally focus into the last layer, the data, the new oil, the most precious resource we have. So let's dive into how zero trust helps us secure our data more.
Yep.
Do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, sure. I think, again, coming to the first principle that we have as verify explicitly, I think the key here is like having like a cloud security policy engine that allows you to govern what access decisions are made. Like, hey, so like based on the policies that I have, who can access this resource or who can access this data? And this is not just like if I get into the infrastructure or if I get into that application, I can access it, but
Hmm.
this affects all data, like across applications, across your infrastructure, like it's throughout, rather than just being at the
Hmm.
perimeter. So that is very
Perimeter.
key. Yeah. Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah, I was just going to say, what are your thoughts on
Um,
like least privilege?
yeah, so least privilege, right? So data classification and labeling,
Mm-hmm.
especially in an automated way, that would be my number one priority in terms of making sure I have least privilege, right? Because
Hmm.
we talked about having access to that data from a user perspective, that we don't want everyone to have access to all kinds of
Yes,
data, right?
absolutely.
But how do we know what kind of data it is we are dealing with?
True.
That's where data labeling and data classification comes really handy. We want to be defining certain policies that automatically tag our data
Mm-hmm.
to be classified within whatever custom custom groups we define, right?
Yeah.
And different cloud providers, that's again one of the good benefits of cloud. You usually do it in a very automated way. Again, not to be vendor, to remain vendor neutral. It's something we're not going to deep dive into it, but if you're interested, just Google your provider's name versus automatic data classification, and you'll see tons of different solutions out there, and that can go a long way in terms of ensuring you have least privilege uh, for your data.
Yeah. Yeah, I think now if I think about assuming breach, right? The key here is I don't want to lose my data, and I want to protect it in some levels, right? So the common way to do this is again using a DLP of sorts, where you have policies in your DLP. That basically, in case like certain data is going to certain sources, you immediately like, hey, flag this, block it, and you can restrict access via that. The other cool part within DLP that you can do is like use sensitivity labels. So depending on the level of like classification that you have, so hey, this is classified, this is declassified, right? So you can set that sensitivity levels that you need, and it also provides a layer of content inspection. Like, hey, this guy's sending an email with a pin. Hey, this is not supposed to happen, right? Like, yeah, so you can provide in different levels. So all those sorts of data
Very
points in
interesting.
different
Yeah.
points.
Assume that the bad guy could be inside the system and act accordingly, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, that's pretty cool. Cool. That was a lot, but we covered a lot of ground. So good on both of us, and thank you again so much for the audience if you
Thank you.
have made it so far. We definitely covered a lot of things, and yeah, it's not expected to remember all that, but again, this episode is more like a manual for you to come back from time to time or get to know some practical ways of doing stuff. That being said, this is obviously, again, not comprehensive, and there's much more ways of achieving um, verify explicitly, least privilege, and assume breach for all the layers we talked about. One final remark I want to make is the things we talked about, they are good security advice in general anyways. What we try to do is look at them through the lens of zero trust and show the audience that zero trust provides us that structured way of implementing all these good advice, right? Because otherwise, we would have had struggle to prioritize, or because there's so many things to do, it's very easy to get lost. Zero trust provides us that um, a framework to uh, efficiently implement all this. What are your thoughts on this,
Yeah,
Surya?
I absolutely agree with that. Again, zero trust at its base is a concept, and then taking this concept to implementation, there are different components that we talked about, the layers, right? Zero
Mm,
trust goes across all the layers compared to our past security principles.
mm,
So that is key. And again, as you said, it's depending on each vendor, the different ways this zero trust implementation can happen. There's not one specific solution. It's taking the concept and implementing in a way that would work in your environment. That is
nice.
key.
Cool. Thank you so much, Surya,
No
for
worries.
this very insightful conversation. As always, I learned so much from you, and
I
thanks
learned so
to our
much from you
audience
too.
for sticking with us. And thanks for listening to us. If you like this episode, then please drop us a like and subscribe. And we are also in Spotify and all of your favorite podcast platforms. If not now already, if not yet, then very soon in all the other platforms. But we are on Spotify for sure. Thanks again for listening, and we hope to catch you in the next one.
Yeah. See you guys.